I'm Dr. Richard Ziley, better known as Dr. Z, and it's an honor to spend this time with you this evening. First thing I'd like to call your attention to is my card. Now, when you're watching a soccer game and someone pulls a foul, what does the referee do? He throws a yellow card. All right. Now, if you see foul things in our Michigan education, I want you to throw this card. Because as you know, there are a lot of fouls being called in Michigan education, and they're coming from the State Board of Education. Now, I had the privilege of serving on the State Board of Education for 8 years, 2011 to 2018. So I have experience and I understand how some of the forces behind the scenes there. When I served on the board, at first, the Democrats had a majority, and they've had a majority on the board for the last 25 years or more, with two or three exceptions, when we had a tied board. Republicans have not had a majority on the 8-member board in 25 years or more. When I was first on the board, the Democrats ignored the problems with public schools and academic performance. Instead, they passed resolutions calling for the investigation of homeschoolers, and they passed a resolution calling for the restriction of charter schools. The Democrats have been very consistent in their opposition to school choice. On the other hand, some of you may recognize my yellow scarf here, the National School Choice Week, and that's a good introduction to who I am. I grew up in Highland Park, Michigan, surrounded by the city of Detroit. And when I was in middle school, I got beat up and I begged my parents, please, can't we move somewhere else where the school isn't so dangerous? My parents sent me to Lutheran High West. And there we were more afraid of the teachers than we were of the bullies. But I realized that the teachers had better plans for me. And I learned things, and I excelled. And I got a scholarship to college, which meant a lot because my family lived on the poverty level. Later on, I came back and I taught in the city of Detroit. And then many of us do a journey. You spend 10 years. My kids were born in 3 other states. In the course of that, I picked up a master's degree from the Rackham School in Education, a master's in church history from Harvard, a seminary degree so I could come back to Detroit as a pastor and headmaster. And I spent another 20 years in both parochial and public schools in the city of Detroit. My kids went to Detroit public schools. 2 of them graduated from Detroit public high schools. And then I helped to organize Old Redford Academy, a very successful charter school in northwest Detroit. And then I became the president of the board of Woodward Academy, another charter school in downtown Detroit, just outside of Greektown. And then I was elected to the State Board of Education in 2011, 2018, and served 8 years. Right now the polls are showing Governor Whitmer losing to the generic Republican. So that suggests that we have a good chance of replacing 2 Democrats and achieving a 4-to-4 split on the Board of Education. Now, when you've got a split, you can't undo the damage that's been done. We cannot call back, for example, the bathroom bill, which the board adopted in 2016. But when I was co-president of the board, 17 and 18, we were able to prevent the policy from being implemented. And that's what's happened since we lost our parity on the board. Now the Democrats have done all kinds of crazy things. They have come out in favor of special protection. They call them protections for transgender children. And they assert things that no child development specialist believes in, like that kids in elementary school have their identities already formed, and they already know that despite their biology, that they're the other gender. such silliness has to be called out, and you need someone equipped to call it out.
Amen.
Now, I have the background, I have the experience to point out the absurdity of many of these policies. I was fighting critical race theory when I was on the board before it became a thing. I was focused on critical race theory and this gender ideology, which is contrary to science. I mean, how can you boast that you are the party of science when you don't know when life begins and you don't know that there's a connection between biology and gender? Okay? So we have to make these points clearly and articulately to the public at large and when decisions are being made. Now, one example I'll give you, when we were on the minority of the board, they presented data that showed that, black students were being suspended at greater rates than white students, and this was obviously evidence of structural racism. And so I pointed out, well, wow, there are way more boys being suspended than girls. That must be the evidence of structural sexism. And there was one doctrinaire feminist who kind of said, oh, maybe you're right. But the rest of them all dismissed it because it didn't serve their narrative. So we need to point out the hypocrisy and lack of logic behind the ideology of the Democrats on the board and elsewhere. Well, let me just clarify one thing. The most important thing the State Board of Education does is to hire the superintendent of public instruction. So he is the head of the Michigan Department of Education. Much of what the State Board does is review reports and feedback from the Department of Education. A lot of that is very routine. 85% of the stuff we did was just getting your head around things. And some people say the board's main job is to be a cheerleader for teachers and so on and so forth. There's some point to that. May I say, too, that on the board, when I was on the board, I gave a lot of my time to make awareness, political stuff, when I wasn't running for office. And I also took a leading role in the National Association of State Boards of Education. I was on their board of directors and nominated to be their president. Unfortunately, I lost to a liberal, but I was able to articulate conservative values in this national level as well. Thank you so much for your time, and